Dr. Neil Falzon is a human rights lawyer who has been working in a number of areas of human rights, but in particular has been, I think, concentrating on the issue faced by migrants. And through his experience from the legal perspective, he'll also be able to tell us something about what kind of issues they face in Europe, in Malta, and this can help us to identify possible solutions.
Thank you and good morning everyone, and again welcome to Malta. I hope you get to enjoy the island whilst you're here. Thank you very much for this invitation. I think it's always nice that NGOs collaborate together to share views and experiences as much as possible to see how we can have joint initiatives on points of key concern. I work for an NGO called Aditus Foundation. It's a local human rights NGO established in 2011. The mission of our organization is to look at the situation on the ground, looking at the reality people are facing vis-a-vis their human rights, and we compare that with Malta's human rights obligations at an international, regional and national level. So what we do in practice is we look at national situations, we look at what Malta should be doing in terms of its human rights obligations under the UN, Council of Europe, EU and even national legislation. And when we identify gaps, we try to raise these gaps with government primarily. That's the starting point of our relations with ministries. And we also engage in litigation. We offer pro bono legal advice to individuals who need assistance to enjoy their human rights. We're engaged in public education. And we're also active in research, which we share with government for the purpose of improving law and policy. And we're also very active as well in legal drafting, which we do in collaboration with Minister Dalli. Where we identify gaps in Maltese human rights legislation, we offer drafts to see how we can improve the quality of Malta's human rights enjoyment. That's in a nutshell what we do. I've been asked today to speak about the problems faced by asylum seekers. However, I'm not very comfortable with that title because it's too negative. And although there's a very long list of problems faced by asylum seekers and refugees, I don't want to just speak about problems, ignoring everything else that's going on in Malta and in Europe. And in fact, I'll try to give a broader perspective than just the local situation. So in fact, what I want to do in the beginning, before I mention problems, is try to have an idea of what's going on around us at the moment and even highlight the positive aspects, because I think it's part of the discussion. If you look at the positive side to it, in the context of what's going on vis-a-vis refugees and asylum seekers, positively is we have a relatively strong legal regime in Europe. It might not be a perfect system, but we have strong international human rights instruments, ICCPR, ICSCR, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There's a whole legal framework there which is very clearly applicable to refugees living in Europe. We also have Council of Europe instruments, very, very strong instruments, the European Convention on Human Rights being the main one, and also the European Court of Human Rights that is open to refugees to challenge actions of government wherever they are living. And within the European Union context, we also have what is known as the Common European Asylum System, which is a set of legal norms regulating different aspects of the life of asylum seekers and in turn of refugees. Again, it's an imperfect system, but it is quite an advanced system in many different respects. It's the only legal system, regional system in the world that actually regulates the reception of asylum seekers, meaning how governments should treat asylum seekers even before their status has been determined. Nowhere else in the world do you have a legal regime that regulates this aspect of the life of an asylum seeker. It's a legal regime which finally takes a very clear stand against the automatic detention of asylum seekers. We have very clear standards, very clear procedures in this common European asylum system against the automatic detention of asylum seekers, which we did have before under the European Convention on Human Rights, but having a European Union law on the matter makes it even stronger. This system also has a lot of strong provisions regulating how vulnerable individuals should be primarily identified and then given the assistance that they require. Within the context of a refugee population, you can imagine the need to have very strong procedures in place to identify vulnerable individuals who otherwise would just slip through the cracks and just not get identified and treated, and to be given appropriate treatment, including victims of trafficking, trauma, physical and sexual violence, unaccompanied minors, and all the other vulnerable individuals forming part of a refugee population. So there is quite a strong legal package in place. The European Union legal system also tells governments how they must treat refugees once they are granted status. Although we talk a lot about the lack of laws on integration, it's not entirely true. The European Union does have laws regulating how refugees should be facilitated to integrate in the whole society. It's what we call the content of protection. The European Union defines very clearly, quite clearly, what are the rights and obligations of refugees and what is known as subsidiary protection beneficiaries within the European Union, persons who are fleeing their homes because of a war situation and not because of persecution. So all in all, the legal system is quite strong. What is lacking, I think, and I'll be talking about that later, is monitoring of the system and possibly effective remedies against violations of the system. And that's what we can be looking at. Another very positive element that I think we need to emphasize, even in this terrible context of what's going on in Greece, Turkey and Italy, and Hungary and so many other border states, all this negative news that we keep seeing on a daily basis, is that in response to the negative news happening at the borders, we're seeing immense solidarity happening on the ground in many member states. Solidarity which might not be coming from governments, but is coming from your next door neighbor, your colleagues, your employers, your friends, your family and friends. We've seen loads of initiatives, online, real, practical, humanitarian initiatives of people reaching out to refugees within their communities and opening their doors and welcoming them. Just look at the amount of marches, protests called Refugees Are Welcome, happening all over the European Union. A clear indication that in spite of many governments wanting to shut the doors in Greece and Italy, you have loads of people, millions of people on the ground raising their voices in favor of welcoming refugees and offering them a dignified life. And I think that is something that we need to acknowledge and not simply get lost in the very dark shadows of what's going on in Greece, Italy, Bulgaria, Serbia, and the list can go on for quite some time. So that's, I think, what we need to talk about. What we also need to talk about in terms of what's going on today, a fear that we have as NGOs working in the field is this overemphasis on Syria. It is acknowledged, yes, that the conflict in Syria is a long-standing one, and the number of people fleeing Syria is unprecedented. We're speaking about millions of people leaving in a relatively short span of time. However, we cannot afford to ignore all of the other refugees who are trying to leave and cannot make it, and to have been living in our territories for so many years and still cannot make it. So yes, let's look at Syria, let's look at how Turkey is dealing with Syria, how the EU is dealing with Syria, but let's not forget Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Somalia, Eritrea, Sudan, ... Let's not forget all of the other refugees who are essentially the same context as the Syrian refugees. So that's just to give a context. Now we can talk about some challenges and some problems faced by asylum seekers and refugees. And although the emphasis of today's conference is integration, I think we cannot forget the difficulty refugees have in actually getting to Europe. It is related to integration, because if you think about a refugee woman living in Italy, whose husband and children are still in Somalia, trying to reach their wife, as his wife and their mother, there is no way for them to get to Italy other than paying smugglers to cross the Sahara, get onto a boat into the Mediterranean and reaching Italy. So access to Europe, so just coming here, is on the one hand a main challenge for refugees who want to seek safety, and it also is an integration challenge. Because if my wife is stuck in a war zone, there is no way I'm going to be able to integrate effectively wherever I'm living. I will constantly be under a state of stress, always wondering, is my wife safe? Are my children alive? How come she hasn't called me for the past 6 months? So it is also an integration challenge. In the issue of access to territory, we're obviously very, very worried about the EU's recent deal with Turkey. I won't be going into the details of the agreement because it's a terribly complex agreement, but essentially it's an agreement which hints at a European Union moving towards what we call externalization of asylum. telling refugees, it's fine to leave your country to seek safety, just don't seek it here. Seek it at those countries just outside the European Union's borders. Turkey, Ukraine, and possibly one day also North Africa. It's a very worrying development, the agreement with Turkey, because it indicates a possible movement in that direction, which we clearly oppose, because we're in favor of a European Union that is open to refugees in terms of giving welcome and shelter. So we clearly advocate constantly as NGOs on what we call safe and legal channels. The European Union needs to find safe and legal ways for refugees to come to Europe. It's unacceptable that the European Union is obliging refugees to get onto boats, to cling onto lorries and trucks, to pay unscrupulous smugglers to seek safety in the European Union. But that's the arrival component, which is a small component of today's session. Once asylum seekers get to Europe, then what? Because obviously before the integration component, there's the whole life before I get my status, which in some member states can last a couple of months, Malta for example, and in some member states it can last many, many years. The gap between arriving in the territory and the government telling you you are actually a refugee. And what happens in that time frame is key for the life of the individual and for the individual's eventual integration. So we ask, for example, what about the implications of the very, very famous now Dublin regulation, which requires asylum seekers to remain in the member state where they entered first the European Union. We have a trend going on nowadays that many asylum seekers are refusing to remain in the border state, in Italy and Greece, because they are aware that because of the Dublin regulation they will be obliged to remain in Italy and Greece ad aeternum, essentially. And to be very, very frank and honest, knowing the way Italy and Greece are treating asylum seekers and refugees, it's perfectly understandable that the vast majority of people do not want to remain in Greece and Italy and want to move on, whether it is to come to Malta, to go to Germany, Austria, Sweden, etc. But that does remain a problem. What we also see is what use are member states making of detention and other coercive measures to keep asylum seekers within their territory. I mentioned before that the current legal regime is very clearly against the automatic use of detention, but we know that detention remains a widespread practice, although international human rights law does not allow governments to penalize refugees for the simple reason that they entered the territory illegally. We still have situations where refugees using fake documents to enter a territory are criminalized. They're prosecuted and thrown in prison. That's the situation we have today in Malta. A number of refugees in prison because the only way they could fly to Malta is by buying a passport. Upon arrival, they are identified as having false documents, prosecuted, taken to court, imprisoned for up to 6 months, which is in breach of international law and an issue that we're trying to remedy at the national level. But in many other member states, you have various forms of criminalization, penalization, detention, etc. Within the context of arrivals of asylum seekers, we always question, as I mentioned before, are we identifying the vulnerable people? Are we identifying the vulnerable? It's clear that in a population movement of asylum seekers, you are bound to have people who have experienced trauma, torture, sexual violence, discrimination, loss of life of family members. They must probably have experienced something at an atrocious level. Are we identifying those people as soon as possible, and are we offering them the treatment necessary for them to rehabilitate? Without rehabilitation, there can be no integration. Without rehabilitation, you cannot be expected to find a regular job and get on with life as we get along with life on a regular basis. We also wonder, in the very early stages of a refugee's life, so still within the process, do children have access to schooling? In Malta, yes, asylum-seeking children have access to school immediately. But there are many member states in Europe where children do not have immediate and automatic access to schooling on the argument that they might not be refugees, we might end up returning them in a few months. So let's not spend too much resources on opening our schools, and they can wait anyway in detention or in their homes until we get them. Again, a breach of international law, but a reality that we see on the ground. To what extent do asylum seekers have access to lawyers, NGOs, UNHCR, and other entities willing to provide assistance? If we look at what's happening at the moment in the hotspots, the places set up in Italy and in Greece to process individuals very, very quickly, there is no access to legal assistance and to NGOs. which means when asylum seekers are making extremely important decisions on what the rest of their life will actually be, they're doing it on their own as new arrivals in a totally alien country, with no one to advise on the possible implications of their decisions. Because there is no access by NGOs, we cannot monitor what is going on. We cannot comment, we cannot provide assistance, we cannot provide support. As the Minister mentioned, in Malta, NGOs have quite a healthy relationship with the Minister responsible for Home Affairs, which means we are constantly present there, offering our assistance, offering our policy interventions. It's not always the case, depending on what issue one is working with, but generally we can be happy over here that we have that kind of access. In many member states, NGOs do not have access to detention centres, which means NGOs have no idea what is happening within the centres. Is there torture? Is there abuse? Is there sexual harassment? Is there sexual violence? Is there rape? Is there discrimination? All of these gaps because we don't have access. We spoke a lot about life now before the procedure. I won't spend much time talking about the asylum procedure itself because that can be a really technical, intense discussion which we can have maybe in a different context. But let's speak about life after status. So you've come to Europe, you've gone through the asylum procedure, and finally you have your certificate, you have status. Then what? Then we expect everyone to integrate. It's what everyone is expected to do. You have to integrate. You have to get your residence papers, open a bank account, have a job, find your bus pass, apply for housing, apply for social benefits, get along with it. What we see in reality is that although the legal framework remains a relatively strong one, and there are institutions in place to make the legal system practicable, we see a lot of problems faced by refugees when trying to get along with it on a day-to-day basis. A very simple example. You have your refugee document, but you also need a residence document, correct? To be regular in a state, you need a residence paper. In many member states, to be given a residence document, you have to have a proven address, which means you probably need to have a landlord who is willing to confirm that you are living at the place you are renting in. The reality is, very few landlords are willing to confirm that they are actually renting to refugees, for a number of reasons. Which means refugees, in most cases, are unable to prove their residence, which means they are unable to obtain a residence document. Without the residence document, it's very difficult to open a bank account, apply for social housing, get your reduced bus card for preferential transport treatment, and basically do the things which we consider fundamental. So access to documentation is fundamental for refugees. So let's try to identify the administrative gaps between an individual applying for the document and actually getting the document. What we also look at is access to employment. Yes, refugees have access to employment, which is a bit of a legalistic term, which means you are entitled to work. The difficulty is the obvious practical challenges in actually finding employers willing to employ refugees, and we see lots of discrimination happening at that point as well. But what we also try to explain is that access to employment means access to dignified employment, mobility of employment, that you can change job if you find a better one. It also means access to vocational training, that one day I'm picking your garbage, the next day maybe I might hope to be an accountant. So the possibility for refugees to improve themselves as they remain in the country and not remaining perpetually in these very low-level, low-skilled jobs that no one in the country is willing to do. It means a job that is non-discriminatory. It means a job that pays the salary that is expected to be paid according to national law. And it also means an employment which, if there are violations on the employment sector, you have access to a remedy to complain against your employer. And you do not face any kind of repercussions for having filed a complaint against your present employer. So for us, access to employment is much, much broader than just me being able to find a job. It also means that if I have qualifications, if I have studied back in Somalia, find a way to recognize and acknowledge my professional and educational background. It is a challenge, definitely, because it's quite challenging to have an equivalence between our degrees and degrees in many countries of origin of refugees, but there needs to be a system in place to acknowledge the professional and educational background of refugees, to make sure that they don't start off their lives in our countries at the lowest rung of the ladder, but they might start at the rung of the ladder which they are generally good at and accustomed to. So that's something that refugees face as a problem throughout. Access to social protection, social benefits. Although we don't enjoy the fact that refugees in many cases have access to social benefits because it's used as an argument against welcoming refugees. The reality is that in the first months of life in our countries, refugees need to have access to social benefits because it takes time to get used to the system and have access to that kind of job that will get you off social benefits. What we also see is in that context, what level of access to health services and mental health services the refugees have. Do our governments have enough professional services in place to actually offer assistance to victims of torture, for example, victims of very specialized forms of sexual violence, etc. So are we again identifying vulnerable refugees and helping them get onto their feet and become independent? That's where we see a number of gaps. What level of political participation do refugees have? If you look around you at most events organized about refugee issues, you will probably not see any refugees in the room. Today is an example of that kind of event, but I understand it's an event intended for a particular audience. But if you look at most public events, meetings and gatherings to speak about refugees, the presence of refugees is quite sad, actually. It's not only because the legal regime might be difficult for refugees to live with, but it's also because on a very social basic level we question whether refugees are given information, given access to the possibility to create their own NGOs, participate in NGOs. Are trade unions and workers organizations, are they opening up their doors to refugees? Do they have a refugee or migrant section? Are they aware of the problems faced by refugees in that section? Do refugees have access to any other kind of NGO? Are they looking for participating in other NGOs that are possibly not related to refugee issues? The National Chess Association, do they have any refugee members? Are refugees hanging out in the social places we hang out on the weekends? Probably not. Because again, the social environment tends to be a bit of a negative one. And that leads clearly to the main challenge faced by most refugees, the issue of racism and discrimination, which now we see is on the rise because of the crisis happening at the eastern and southern borders. There's a parallel rise in xenophobia and racism, coupled with what I mentioned before, an also rise in a welcoming spirit by other sectors of society, which leads to a situation where governments are a bit confused. Do my voters like refugees? Do they want to welcome all these Syrians? Or should I be more concerned about the rising right-wing group that's organizing protests and attacks against refugee centers? It's a bit of a confusing situation. What we try to advocate for constantly is, as the Minister said, dignified life, which is based on access to fundamental human rights, where racism and discrimination have no place. So what we expect over there is refugees being informed of the possibility to complain against discriminatory practices. If you're not allowed into a bar because you're black, file a complaint. There's somewhere you can go, and they will treat you nicely, they will explain the procedure, and you will get an effective remedy. You cannot find a place to rent because they're accusing you of stinking out the place, file a complaint. There should be NGOs, there should be institutions there to provide information to refugees on methods they have to access these systems and actually to get recourse. The last point I wanted to mention, which is fundamental for refugee integration, and I think it's the most sensitive subject for all governments, is what happens in the long term. What happens to refugees who have been refugees for 15 years? If the war in Somalia in a couple of years ends, do we honestly expect all the Somalis living in Malta to go back? No. Do we honestly expect all the Somali children who've been brought up over here, who speak Maltese better than I do, who know much more of the Maltese culture than I might ever do, who have Maltese friends, they're in university, their parents have set up companies, they're doing extremely well as semi-integrated refugees. Do we expect them to fly back to Mogadishu in 5 years' time? If we do, then we'll be paying an extreme disservice to refugees. Which means what we must be talking about is long-term prospects for refugees. You cannot be a refugee for life. At one point, you have to stop being a refugee and you become either a long-term resident, a permanent resident, and eventually, hopefully, a citizen of the country that hosted you and welcomed you. As an incentive for you to make that added effort to integrate, yes, let's give an incentive. If you make an effort, we will reward you with becoming part of the community. But also as a reality, we cannot expect refugees to remain refugees forever. At some point, it must stop. the cycle of renewal of documents, of discrimination, of feeling an outsider, of being an outsider, has to stop. So let's open our doors and make refugees truly part of our community.